Hi, I'm Jalen Rose, and welcome to the Renaissance Man podcast, proudly presented by the New York Post, a show where we cover trends in fashion, entertainment, current events, and everything in between. My next guest is a brother from another mother, an Emmy Award winning sports commentator, journalist, and host whose hilarious, entertaining, and historical perspectives are laced with rhetoric that makes audiences think. His show, Game Theory, who I, by the way, appeared on season one, the first episode, presents the news through the lens of the culture and sports. It's now in its second season and it airs Friday nights on HBO Max. So make sure y'all check that out. It is my honor to welcome the incredible Bomani Jones to the show. What up, family?
Dude, what's going on, man? I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time. And I know all about your history and your path, but I want to introduce it to our audience. So you were born in Atlanta,
right,
and raised in Houston.
Right.
Tell me about your childhood. What was your childhood like and how either of those cities shaped you?
Yo, it's interesting because when I think about the cities, I've always said that if I ever got arrogant enough to write a memoir, that I might make the point I'm from everywhere and nowhere all at one time. And so we lived in Atlanta until right before I turned 7, with a year that we actually spent in Nigeria because my parents had fellowships at a university in Nigeria. And interestingly, in the town that Masai Ujiri is from.
Wow.
And so we moved to Houston, and it was always a trip because our Atlanta situation was very Pan-African, like very red, black, and green. Like I can show you the class pictures in the dashikis and everything else, right? We sang, lift every voice, and sing every morning. Like I remember my first day of school in Texas, they gave us something to color, and it was a guy in a cowboy hat, like in full Texas gear. Right. And I colored him in red, black, and green stripes all the way down, right? Because that's what I knew. That's what I was of. And so then we go to Houston, and I was in this interesting situation where we lived in the northwest suburbs of the city. Like this, it's Houston, Texas on the address, but especially black people from Houston, they don't count my Houston as being Houston. They don't know nothing that happened outside the 610 loop. Like that don't count for them, but I got nothing else to call it. But my parents worked at Prairie View A&M University when I was growing up, which is 25 miles northwest of that. Wow. And that's where I went to school because my parents, my dad in particular, was a little too concerned that where we live was just a little bit too white for him to safely trust his child in their education system.
Right.
Great decision, by the way. He was absolutely right. And so I got this wild thing where I went to school with people who lived in a completely different socioeconomic world than I did. They lived in a rural world where mine was more urban and suburban, like all of that. And then I go home after school 25 miles away, and we're not getting home till dark. So I'm not playing with my friends after school because they live there. And I'm not playing with the people after school who live around me because it's already too late for that, you know? So with Atlanta, the big thing I picked up out of Atlanta, if nothing else, is just the blackness of it all, right? Like you don't ever really have to compromise your black in order to get by in Atlanta in a way that doesn't really hold in the other places. Where Houston and Prairie View and Waller and Hempstead and those little towns I spent time in, what they did for me was give me exposure to everybody. And I've been fortunate with my parents to have exposure to all the academics, you know, and all those types of people. But what I really got out of Houston was the exposure up and down the class spectrum and understanding what life is for people who did not. I was very familiar with people who were not like me in ways that I don't think that people get. So like what I've learned in my content is I know the things that country white boys do that we do too. And when I'm talking about it and you think, oh, you just talk about this black stuff, and they might not tell you out loud, but the country white boys is like, yeah, the Chronic was my jam. You know what I mean? Like I know their specific things. And so I've been fortunate in my life to have exposure to people all the way up and all the way down. And that helps me, like when I'm coming up with stuff, it just makes it easy for me to understand what it is that we all about.
So you're very knowledgeable. You're very versatile. And that's one of the things I think makes you really successful in the industry. Who are some of the sports icons you looked up to while you were growing up, and how did sports play a part in your childhood?
Oh man. So first thing I always say, first thing I ever loved in this world was the Atlanta Braves. And so it was, but the way that worked, and this is where the city thing comes in, we moved to Houston right before I turned 7. And I had no idea how cable television worked. It never dawned on me I would still get to watch the Braves. So I'm in a place that's totally unfamiliar. But not only are the Braves coming on, it's the Central Time Zone. They're coming on an hour earlier. I can actually watch the start of the West Coast games now. Yeah. Like that was huge for me. And then like when your name is Bo, and then Bo Jackson comes around, like I remember, and I think you probably remember this poster too, the Bo Knows poster that went long ways, and it had him in the baseball uniform and the football, and then in basketball, and then in biker shorts and all of that stuff. When I was a kid, I said, people were like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I wanted to be a jack of all trades, because people had always told me I could do all these different things, and I wanted to do them all. And I look back at it, and I just thought about this about 10 years ago. That Bo Jackson poster is that. Yes. Like that Bo Jackson poster is that concept and that idea. And when you really look at like what I do now, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's a whole lot of everything, right? So like that was a big one. Warren Moon was a big one. And I didn't even realize how big it was until later, because I didn't pay that much attention to football before we got to Houston. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it was perfectly normal that your quarterback was black. Mm-hmm. I thought it was more strange that his last name was Moon than the idea that the quarterback was black. So there's that, I grew up in the generation of Jordan. We got that one. I grew up, not saying this just because I'm here, but obviously the Fab Five was one of those things where somebody my age, because I was 11 when you guys went to the Final Four for the first time. The thing was, somebody my age, I couldn't fully appreciate how revolutionary it was, because everything was new to me. You know what I mean? It was all coming there. But then when you go back and look at it and you realize, no, this charted the course of a lot of stuff that went on in my life. Like those are the ones I think about heavy off the top of those guys.
So you brought up Warren Moon, and his path to the NFL was unconventional based on what you see from quarterbacks nowadays, and people of his talent having to go prove that he can play in the international leagues in theory, and people wanted him to play a different position and all of that. So what is it like for you when you're watching the Super Bowl last night, and all of a sudden there's Patrick Mahomes and there's Jalen Hurts both starting in the Super Bowl at quarterback?
It's a bigger deal than I thought it would be at this point in my life, right? And we did something on Game Theory about this, and Jalen Hurts was excellent in the Super Bowl. I want to be clear. But in the end, we've seen a lot of dudes like Jalen Hurts before. Like, he's not the most talented player that we have ever seen. Like, to be fair, if Patrick Mahomes is dropped off into the world in 1977, somebody gonna take him. Like, they might, like, it might be a little tough, but we had to be like X-Men, right? Like, you got to be some kind of mutant in order to get that gig in so many cases. Jalen Hurts is very good at a lot of things, right? But there's, other than like short yardage running, nothing you could point to as being supremely excellent. And they built a team around him. And that's the part that we never got. And then when he got out there, he played over his head. Like, he played better than I thought he could play in that game. We had seen him come up short in national championship games in college, but he got into the Super Bowl and he made that thing happen. And what warmed my heart about that was he didn't have to be the greatest quarterback anybody's ever seen. Like, he's a good dude, a solid dude. You know what I mean? Like, the ones that people want to play for, all that stuff that they acted like we weren't ever able to do. And then on the other side, is probably the greatest quarterback that's ever played football. And I know that people think it's early to say this, but you can vouch for me on this one. I remember my daddy in like 91 being like, Michael Jordan is the best.
Yes.
Period. You're like, boy, it sure feels a little early to say that. No. Jordan didn't do nothing after that, but more of what he had done before.
Correct.
That's where we are with Mahomes. All he's doing now is what he's done from day one. And after 6 years, we ain't never been able to say this about nobody like ever before. Like, Tom Brady got 7 Super Bowl rings. Cool. That's great. I'll take this dude over Tom Brady every single time.
Absolutely. And just the arm talent, his ability to run, his ability to throw, his ability to play with poise, play under pressure, play in the clutch. And it seems like, don't we know that he's going to throw it to Travis Kelce? like at some point, I'm like, why don't you just try to double team Travis Kelce? But I want to ask you this as well. One of the things that also stood out to me about that game, And you and I can have this conversation, but it's going to make some people uncomfortable. Eric Bieniemy is what I consider a black person that's overqualified for the job, which means he comes in as a new head coach and would command an economic salary of like $5-10 million a year. And so therefore, he's not gotten hired as a head coach while he's nurturing what you just mentioned to me is the greatest quarterback that you've seen. Yet, as long as you and I've been watching football, we notice when offensive coordinators do far less with far less quarterbacks, they get elevated to head coaching positions. So what is your take on why Eric Bieniemy hasn't been hired and given that blank check to be a head coach?
So I think there's two levels to evaluate this on, right? The first level is this game got rules, and this game says that if you put together a Eric Bieniemy-like resume, somebody's going to give you the chance to be a head coach. Adam Gase got to be a head coach on the basis of what he did with Peyton Manning, who has been coaching himself basically since he was like 19 years old. But Adam Gase got a job on the strength of that and became a hot name. We can go look at all the Andy Reid assistants and see all the ones, the offensive coordinators that managed to get on somewhere. But the only thing I say about Bieniemy, and I try to be careful about this because this can happen to us very often where we get so locked in on one name and we're just like, yo, why is this one guy not getting the job, all of these things. In this time that Eric Bieniemy has not gotten head coaching jobs, other black people have gotten head coaching jobs, to which I do have to ask, what don't I know? Because I feel like there's something I don't know. I can think off the top of my head. You may know who the guy is I'm talking about. I don't want to put his name on it, but I think you may know. He's in the NBA, and he's one of these dudes that was an assistant. He played in the league for a while, and every year he didn't get a job, and people were like, why is it that nobody ever gives this guy a job? I just can't understand why he can't get a job. Man, he had that job, and it took 3 weeks, and we were like, oh, that's why that guy's never gotten a job. Gotcha. So that's my only reservation. But the reality is you get a job for doing the job that he's done. Now, all of a sudden, we got all this common sense and this, hey, but you got to think about this, you got to think about that. You don't have to do that. They're just choosing to do that. And and for me, it's very uncomfortable to watch what's happening with him. Even though I can entertain the possibility there's a good reason, that don't mean the reason good enough.
Correct. And also, here's another thing I want to get your opinion about that. And I want to make sure I stress this part. I feel like he's overqualified. The black coaches that have gotten the jobs in this same period of time, they didn't necessarily command a record-breaking salary. See, if you look at his resume and what he accomplished, it's not come in and pay him $3 to $5 million. He's going to come in and command one of the top salaries in the game, which means he's going to put up 5 years, 35 million, 40 million from the jump. And I think that's what makes people uncomfortable with hiring him. But they didn't have that same level of discomfort with Matt Rule.
Right.
I saw him go from college to Carolina and get a blank check for 70 million that he's still trying to get them to pay him. That's
even though he got another job.
Exactly. That's what I think it is for Bieniemy. They don't want to give him a top dollar type of deal from the beginning.
Yep. And you know what it is? When you dedicated to not doing something, it's amazing. You'll keep going till you get a better reason, till you get a better reason, till you get a better reason. And then you get there and boom. Now you got the reason. And for him, like, what do you do from there? Like, I mean, I remember him playing in college almost 35 years ago, right? So he's in his 50s. The window for him, the time has just kind of passed at this point. Like, if you're going to be the old dude getting your first chance, you need to be a grizzled defensive coordinator. They still like that archetype, right? Yep. But what is it? What is it for him? And I just really feel bad for him because he's been so good. He's been so important. That's why after the game, Andy Reid's out there like, yo, Eric Bieniemy did a great job. Ain't none of y'all got desperate enough to ring this man's phone, except for maybe I think the Houston Texans called him, but I'm glad for him that he had too much dignity to take it.
Right. Absolutely. And speaking of money, you actually studied economics at one point.
Yeah.
You were even working towards your PhD. A lot of people don't realize that. When did you decide that you wanted to make the switch in the sports media? And how was that received by people closest to you?
Well, if I may be honest, I made the decision to switch fully to sports media very similarly to the way that most college basketball players make the decision to switch to a regular job and not go to the NBA, where the NBA tells you you might want to consider going pro in something else. No, I did 2 years in North Carolina in the PhD program, and the way it works is you take what's called qualifying exams at the end of your first year. There's one in macro, there's one in micro. And the micro qual is the weed out test. And I passed the macro the first time and I took the micro twice, and I did not pass it. But if I'm going to be honest, it's the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was doing the PhD in large part because I wanted a media career. And I thought that, like, having that backup, I could be like a Michael Eric Dyson type, right? A Cornell West type with that PhD behind me. And none of those guys in that space had one in economics, right? And my mother's an economics professor, you know, all of that. And so I had been writing about stuff, I would say, since I was a senior in college. So when I was 19, I started writing about music and kind of doing like lifestyle columns, politics type stuff. And the sports thing was interesting because I didn't know how you got in there. Like, I didn't know the angle. Like, you want to write a music review, you just got to get the album, right? You can just write about it. I'm like, how do I do this about sports? And what happened and how I got into sports was a buddy of mine met a gentleman named Ralph Wiley at a book signing. And I had just written something and I asked him to send it to Ralph just to get his thoughts. And Ralph said he liked it. And Ralph stayed in touch with me. And for those of you who are not familiar with Ralph Wiley, for my money, the best sports writer who has ever lived. And when I start talking about like that jack of all trades type of stuff, remember this. First of all, Ralph Wiley was on the staff at Sports Illustrated in 1982 as a black man. And in 1991, he left because he became the head of Rocket Ismail's like marketing team. And Sports Illustrated's like, you can't do both. And he was like, cool, holla at you. That's how cold that man was, right? Then wrote classic books, wrote Johnny Cochran's bio, was a columnist at ESPN.com's page 2. Like, he is the sensei for me and will always be. And one day he sent me something about a story that, you know, something that was going on in the news. And I hit him back and I gave him my thoughts. And I said, well, hey, if you want to write about this, I know some people that can help you. And then the next day I got an email from ESPN.com that said, hey, Ralph said you can write this. You think you want to? Can you imagine that? Like, Ralph Wiley being like, nah, he got this. And I'm like,
that's dope.
Me?
That's dope. And
so then I was in, right? I was like, okay, I left grad school in 05 and I decided in 1 year, I'm going to earn a contract at ESPN.com. That's my goal. I'm freelancing for them and I'm going to do it. And in 1 year I did it. And then 1 year after that, they did me. They were like, yeah, thanks for stopping by the booth. It's been real. It's been fun. It ain't been real fun. But then, 3 years later, I came back around and here we are.
So your intellect continues to shine, and clearly you do a lot of reading. So it's only right that I ask you, what are your top 5 sports books that you've read?
Okay. Number 1, and this may blow a few people's minds, but number 1 for me without question is Friday Night Lights by Buzz Bissinger. Not the movie, not the TV show. I understand sports so much better from reading that book because it put sports in the context of identity and the people who consume and care about. So it's obviously about high school football and all this, but it also kind of doubles as a sociological study. It doubles as a study of race in the 1980s in America. But what it really helped me to understand was why sports were so important to the people who watch them. And it's because those athletes are reflective of their values, right? It's reflective of something about them. And that's why they invest in these teams. Like, the teams in sports that have the biggest fan bases and the most loyal ones are the ones where that team and that brand, people associated with something bigger, right? And I learned that from reading that book. Number 2, I would say it's a compilation, but Classic Wiley, which is a book that ESPN put out about a collection of Ralph Wiley's work that I think will give anybody a great chance to really understand who that man was and where he was coming from on all those things. There's another one called Brand NFL. I think the author is Mark Leibovich, but I know it's a book that the Players Association gives guys to understand what the game is. But if you want to know how the NFL sells itself and how we get there, that is a big one. What is that one I used? There's another one that I really like. Jackie Robinson's autobiography called I Never Had It Made. I think that that's a very big one for people to check out because it gives you a whole different impression of Jackie Robinson than the one that you may have had just from, they treat him like Martin Luther King on his day, right? Like, oh, Jackie made us so much better. Hey, what a good guy. Jackie was a gangster, man. Story about Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis being in the Army together, and somebody broke bad with Joe Louis, and Jackie Robinson put a pistol in his mouth.
Wow.
His mouth.
Wow.
Like, that's crazy. Yeah, but man is not playing any games. And then after that, I don't know, we start getting the list, it get a little tricky, but I do think that a book worth it for people to read is called Jim Brown, The Fierce Life of an American Hero by Mike Freeman. It's a great bio of Jim Brown. It's not plaster sainthood. I think it does a very fair job of dealing with him and all the good and bad that comes with Jim Brown. But I think that those 5 will get you a long way.
That's a terrific list. And I want to, again, congratulate you on your new show in its 2nd season, Game Theory. I had the honor of representing the Fab Five on a hilarious segment about Coach K's legacy. Can you give the audience a little behind the scenes of how you guys come up with some of the great material that you use?
Dude, I'll tell you, so much of this is somebody's like, hey, I got an idea. And then they throw it out. And like the wildest thing about this operation, so like what Jalen talks about is we did something on Coach K, and I was sitting at home and I was just like, I grew up hating Duke. Every black person I knew hated Duke, right? And I'm like, why do we all hate Duke? And then I sat down and thought about it. Temple, UNLV, the Fab Five, Arkansas. We just went up and down the list and we realized, man, they beat every team black people loved. And by the way, wasn't like they was cheating and beating us, right? Right. Like I imagine you could tell people the moment that you realize that Christian Laettner really was that dude. Because I used to be like, oh, they hyping it up. And then I went back and realized it. He gave it to Weber. He gave it to Shaq. He gave it to Mourning. He gave it to Mutombo. Like all those people. He gave it to, eventually gave it to Larry Johnson, right? Like they gave it to all of them. And I was like, wow, they really terrorized our people. And I just wanted to do a long essay about, and white people loved it, right? Because white people love watching black people lose at basketball to white people, right? They like that for them is like watching the great debaters. That's what it is for them. They watching, that's glory road for them, right? They overcoming. And then my man James, my executive producer, was like, what if we did a museum exhibit of Coach K terrorizing Black America? And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm in. And so we throw that to the writers, and the writers are like, well, what exhibits could we put in? And then you wind up with a document of like 15, 20 pages of different exhibits. And then the day the office opened, the first day we were in the office in person, I come in, I sit down, we're having a meeting, somebody's on Zoom. Dog, they laying out specs. Like we got a floor plan of the museum, and they're telling me that this is going to be here, this is going to be here, the cameras are going to be here, we're going to do this here, we're going to do everything else. And they're like, yo, how can we, then spruce, do this? And they're like, hey, you think Jalen Rose might be down to come? And I was like, I'll ask, right? Like it would be an honor. And it was honestly one of the great, that whole thing, because it was the first big thing we ever shot for that show. And I remember I walked in and my guy Rod, one of our writers who helped put it together, who's also a Carolina fan, and he doesn't work in the business. Like this is his only industry job that he's had. And I just remember I walked up next to him and I put my hand on his shoulder because he was just sitting there with his arms folded like, I cannot believe this is happening. And then when you walked in and we started showing you the stuff and you were like, oh, wait, this is funny. Yes. Like I was so honored that you even came in the first place. But then when you saw what we were doing and you were like, oh, this is what the game needs. And so that's what we do. Like we really just get a room full of people and we got a team where you can cook up an idea. And then next thing you know, people are like, well, is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. Like for the episode, one of the episodes we got coming up, we sent our team to Salt Lake City because the All-Star games in Salt Lake City, which is mind-blowing for a black person. And Absolutely. So we kind of putting together like a guide on that. We go talk to Vernon Maxwell to have him do some stuff for us. But it's wild to have this place where, when you do daily TV, you just getting the rundown and cranking that out. Here we got stuff we work on for months trying to figure out and get right. And they just come back to me and be like, yo, we ought to do a focus group. Yeah, okay, so we did a focus group. Yeah, we got all these people. These are all the people that are going to show up. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Like so much goes on around here. And I don't even know what's going on because the team just comes up with so much stuff and then they run it by me. I'm like, yeah, run with that.
I love it. It's dope. And you guys are crushing. I have to tell you something. When you see my guy, Mad Max, tell him I said, what up, though? There was a time the night before we played the Rockets, when I was in Houston hanging out with Mad Max and we got into a little fender bender going into the spot. That's my guy. The other thing I want to acknowledge is I checked out your Jake Paul interview. It was hilarious. So talk to me about the before and after, how that came about.
All right. So we had decided we wanted to do something about Jake Paul. And I want to be very clear that Jake Paul later accused us of trying to use him and his name for clout. 100% true. No question about that, right? We're like, yo, this is a topic that has a broad reach, and there are interesting things legitimately about him and his boxing thing. And so my showrunner was like, I think I know Jake Paul's people. Let's try to, see if we can get an interview with him. Mm-hmm. And then we got an interview. We were having the hardest time scheduling it, but we scheduled the interview for January 2nd in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. So we took our whole team to Cleveland, Ohio on January 1st, where I stayed at a DoubleTree that didn't have cookies. Just want to throw that out there, right? Just so you know the sacrifices I'm willing to make.
Freezing cold, first of the year, all of that.
Yeah, so we go up to Cleveland, and it's a very long, protracted story, but the interview could not go down, which makes nobody happy, but it's life, right? We get on the plane, we come back, we're trying to get this interview straight, and then finally we scheduled the interview. And we decided we're going to do it on Zoom because he was in Dubai. So we were going to Zoom it up with him in Dubai. And we had started doing some research because we were doing stuff on his gambling app, and we'd done some research and called some people about his gambling app. And some of them called Jake Paul and told his team that we were doing that. And they're like, what are you doing? What kind of, we thought it was just a friendly interview. We're like, yo, we're doing our research about the interview. It's a legitimate journalistic endeavor. And so he comes in and we start the interview, and it was going pretty smooth. And it didn't really start to turn until I started asking questions about the gambling app. Like the first time I asked a question about the gambling app, he put the computer on mute, said something to somebody, and then came back around. And so throughout the interview, already up until that point, his bag is to like insult you. Mm-hmm. And so I said something about, like, he was talking about how he'd been knocking these dudes out. And I'm like, hey man, so when you put these fights together, are you looking for knockouts? Are you looking for good fights? Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, clearly you don't know very much about how boxing works and the odds. So, I can educate you. I'm like, yeah, please do. Please educate me, right? And so he goes and does it. And then there's another point where I forget what he said. I tried to ask him some question about the gambling app. And really what I wanted to know, and this was the point of what we were doing, your audience is largely kids, and now you're selling gambling. Like, do you worry about the streams crossing? And he said something to me about, I know you probably think you're getting over on me. Most of your guests aren't smart enough to recognize what it is that you're doing. And that's when I laughed in his face. God. And so I literally started laughing, and he didn't know what to do at that point. Nobody ever laughed in Jake Paul's face. And I was like, dude, anybody trying to fool you? I asked the question again, and then he answered it. And then it went a little bit more. And at some point he tells me that he doesn't know who the bleep I am, and just starts like hollering at me and everything else. And the biggest thing about that I recognized was, I think he thinks I'm younger than I am, because if I'm 42 years old, man, you're not going nanny boo boo me into having some fight with you. Like, I'm not going to lose my composure in dealing with you. And once he realized that wasn't going to happen, he was out of bullets. Mm-hmm. He ain't have nothing else. Like, yo, you got a hustle going. It's impressive, but at the same time, I admit I am a little disturbed by the idea that we're acting like you're a real boxer when you don't box boxers. Like the whole idea of, they try to get you, oh man, boxing's dead. If boxing's dead, then when I was in Vegas last May, who was all them sad Mexicans after the Canelo fight? If boxing is dead, Canelo might have been dead, but boxing seemed to be very alive that night.
Absolutely. And again, Game Theory is in its second season. Make sure y'all check that out on HBO Max. Bomani Jones, as I mentioned, is incredible at what he does. But before I let you get out of here, family, I have a rapid fire segment called Gone in 60 Seconds. You ready to do this?
Let's do it.
So I know we're professionals and we have corporate jobs, but coincidentally, you grew up in Atlanta and Houston. So I have to ask you, which city has the better strip clubs and why?
The answer is Atlanta. And the reason is it's a show in Atlanta. You know what I mean? It is a production. It is a Cirque du Soleil sort of situation in Atlanta. In Houston, it's a bit more of it's a really, really, really good time, right?
God.
Like, I feel like the top level strip clubs in Atlanta are like great restaurants,
Yes.
great restaurants. And the best strip clubs in Houston are like your favorite spot.
God.
Like, yo, they got the best tacos over there. You know what I'm saying? you go to Magic City in Atlanta and you're like, yo, just pick anything off the menu. Whatever. It's all good.
No question. Especially them lemon pepper wings.
Yes.
You now make your home in Harlem. I love
Yes.
Harlem so much. Tell me your go-to food spot in the neighborhood.
All right. Probably the best one for me to lean to on that is Melba's at 114th in Frederick Douglass. That's the one.
I just saw them do an interview about that restaurant.
Yeah.
It's a soul food restaurant.
Yep.
Yeah, I need to go check that out.
No, you got to do Melba's. You got to do Melba's. The brunch game is strong. All of it, man. It might take a little while for them to get their food to you, but they're going to do it.
No doubt. No doubt. So who is one of your dream guests that you hope to have on Game Theory?
Oh, man. It's a long list of people that I look at where I go back on. I'll be like, dude, I would just love to have that guy come on to be on the show. Honestly, I would love to have Kevin Durant on. Like, when we first started the show, one of my goals was I would like episode 1 to be Kevin Durant because I think it would just be a great conversation. You know what I mean? Like, because I find him to be, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, like since he left Golden State, I just find the world and situation that he lives in to be so fascinating and interesting to look at. And like, if I could get to a point where he trusted me enough to give like some sincere answers about some of these things, like I think he's gotten a bad rap in a lot of ways, but he's also somehow maybe the most underrated great player that there's ever been. Like, you as somebody of, remember how crazy it was, the idea of you being like a 6'8" point guard and that dude's a 7'2" guard?
Crazy.
Right?
That is insane. And also, that's a terrific answer because I agree with you. Like, in the social media era, he's been the great player that while he's accomplished so very many things, there are a lot of things that people question and challenge about him that I would love to hear him talk, and you would be the perfect person to do that. So we need to make that happen.
I'm gonna figure it out. Hook or crook.
Yeah,
I'm gonna figure that out.
We need to.
Oh damn! I just realized he just moved. I liked it a lot better when he lived right down the street.
Yes, you had a closer chance. And last but certainly not least, if you could give a young Bomani a piece of advice, what would it be?
They know how smart you are. You don't have to tell them. That's the biggest one. I was talking to my man Adonde once about Michael Jordan, and he made a great point. He said, the thing that people don't recognize about Mike is so good at talking about how good he is in a way that's never off-putting. Like, we don't have any of those quotes that come off. Like, Kevin Durant has one. I thought he got a bad rap for the I'm Kevin Durant quote. Like, it made perfect sense in context, but that's the kind of, Michael Jordan has no moment that ever goes like that. And what you have to do, and this is something LeBron James as a basketball player was very good at, where I felt like Kobe Bryant was not. LeBron is able to make his teammates feel good about how good he is. Like, how good he is makes them better rather than threaten them or to scare them. Like, Jordan had that problem too, is that he's frightening them. Your talents are only good to other people for how you serve them. You know? And so if me being smart doesn't help people or isn't done in a way that makes them feel good, then it don't matter. So like, the way that I approach it now, like I try my best to approach all this stuff is, it's not, let me show you all this stuff I know. It's like, hey, let me put you on game, because people appreciate that. Like, now we all know this. It's like, yo, well, have you heard this? Yo, it's the craziest thing. I just saw it the other day. As opposed to, what, you don't know that? You know what I mean? It's like you give it to people in that way. It's like doing basketball, like talking about basketball on television. TNT's broadcast works so well because they just talking to you like you talk about basketball.
Well said. That's a terrific answer. And every Friday night, make sure you guys are checking out my brother, Bomani Jones, on Game Theory, HBO Max. I appreciate you taking the time, my brother. Thanks a lot.
Dude, thank you for everything, man. Like, folks don't know, Jalen, the big reason I wound up getting to ESPN. He made the last call in 2013 to drive me over the top. We never talked before. On a different podcast, I can tell you what the first words he said to me. We just ain't gonna do that right here.
Appreciate you, family. That's love.
Thank you, man.